Okay, great. So yeah, so the perfect layers that we're talking about today, today's tutorial is basically same thing as Brian mentioned. You know, there's a lot of us Lightroom users that love to do much of the processing as possible, and I know there's photographers that were also suggesting that, you know, a lot of these things can also certainly be done in Lightroom. But I think that the technical part of this for me as a photographer and obviously working this as an artwork is that, you know, we really want to work on the raw file. And I think at the end of the day, whether we debate back and forth, you know, with our workflow and our processing, you know, we've really all been attached to Lightroom because we want to do as much work on that raw file. Sure, we can convert it out to a JPEG, which most of us do, and do some follow-up processing in the meantime. But I think ultimately to get the best quality and that we can out of this file, and of course, you know, a non-destructive approach is truly what we're looking for. That's what entices that if we can create not only our color corrections, our darkening, our lightening, any approach we can through Lightroom. And in this case, this perfect layers now is allowing me to add one more step that I can do without having to go again back into Photoshop. So I definitely have a love for both products, and I am a heavy Lightroom user, so I'm excited to share with you as a wedding photographer what I've been doing to kind of add this work to my workflow. So let's get out of this Lightroom section here, and let's take us back into the section where I've got a separate folder here I've made specifically for perfect layers. So I'll try to do this as slow as possible and try to get us as much detail about what we're doing here. Now, first and foremost, you'll notice I've got images in here, and I'm going to probably work on two images. I'm going to work on what I can do, and again, in my world, which is wedding photography. I'm going to kind of show you what I've been excited to do with this product with a single image, and then the second version of an image I'll bring out will show you kind of a real simple composite that'll show you how this works. So again, the whole process for me is that anything that I can do in Lightroom, these are all raw files for the most case, and that's what I'm looking for, is to get the best quality out of my file. And again, it's a non-destructive approach, and that's really why we're excited for this product. So I'm going to start with a simple image, and let's go down. And again, I'll give you kind of a step-by-step of that. I am in Lightroom, so you'll notice I am in the Develop module. Let me bring this down so you can see. I'll hit the D for Develop, and some of these tools I can cross out here. So we'll kind of go step-by-step. Now, the first image, let me go back over here, and let's work on this image here right in front of us. Now again, this is a raw file, and certainly as I'm doing my conversions, when I'm doing wedding photography, I'll normally bring in 3,000 plus photos from a wedding, and as I go through Lightroom, you know, I'm doing over here on this right-hand side, you'll notice I'm certainly working on my color temperature, working on exposure, etc. So there's many tabs that we go through just to get this to be ready for the next level. And I think I get that question all the time, is are you really enhancing every image? So I think I'll address that real quickly. When I do a conversion to a JPEG file, just to give a client a proof, let's call it, you know, I convert the RAWs to a JPEG just to show a wedding couple their wedding proofs. You know, I normally just do this at a very neutral. I'm just doing only exposures. I'm only doing the color temperature, real minor things to make a JPEG for the client's proofs. But for today's demonstration, once a client, for example, has ordered a photo from me, says, you know, we'd like to have a wall portrait, or we'd like this to go in our wedding album, and I'm about ready to export this into a folder that's going to be ready for a wedding album design, then I can come back into Lightroom, relaunch, pull my selections that the bride has chosen, and in this case she's chosen, let's say, this pose. Now I'm going to come back, and now this is a raw file. I can do some advanced editing, and that's what I want to take you through, including the perfect layers. So first and foremost, just a couple quick keys here. In Lightroom, I always talk about this just in a quick thing. People always talk about workflow in Lightroom, but certainly the 2 or 3 things that I work on is obviously color temperature. And certainly that's the #1 thing that I do in Lightroom, is adjust all the images in that scenario. Obviously exposure is another important thing that I use in this case. I'm certainly always looking for, in this case, and I think a lot of us having to do with exposures, is we're looking for the brightness in the faces. Now if you're a wedding photographer, you're going to notice that a lot of times we're trying to keep detail here. and this is what this demonstration is for, is I want to keep detail in my wedding dresses, and that's usually the hardest part, because notice as I lower the exposure, watch the dress, even though the face, I've already thought the exposure on the face at this point is perfect, but if I want to add more detail, you have two options. Most cases photographers are told, okay, maybe do the recovery slider, which in most cases I don't like that as much because it really does kind of a muddy look to the face. So this is where the perfect layers comes in for me. Let me back up for a second. You'll notice down here on the Lightroom panel, these are 3 different exposures. So here's how I'm using the perfect layers. Now, first of all, this same image, I'm going to reset this. Let me just reset this from scratch. I'm going to come over here and make a virtual copy of this. Okay, so if you're a Lightroom user, you just right-click on that. You're making a virtual copy, so that's the original one, is making an exact copy of that. And basically the first one, I'm going to leave that alone. Okay, I would leave that untouched. And the second one, I'm going to make my correction. Now earlier I mentioned to you that in this case I may have worked a little bit on the color temperature. And going back to what we're talking about in the exposure of the dress versus the face, if we look at the face, I think all of us when we're doing a density check or darkening lighting, we're always looking at the exposure of the face. So if I'm looking at just the face, and I think that's just about right, but then look what happens to the dress sometimes. And the dress usually gets kind of blown out, and as much as you play with this all day long. So what I do is on this second exposure here is I can actually adjust for that, and I can come over here and I can actually lower the dress. I'm looking just at the dress. I can lower the exposure on this dress. I'm going to exaggerate this just so you can see it in your screen. Now, by the way, if I'm just working on the dress exposure only, and I want my original picture, that's going because both of these layers are going to be basically brought into perfect layers, I can go to my original one, by the way, if I can back up, and I can keep the exposure on the face. And maybe that's what I probably would have done, is just get for the color temperature, get my skin tone, go from that. Then on the second layer, okay, even though I may have zeroed out this color temperature, I don't have to worry about that. I'm going just for the exposure. Okay, so that's number 2. Okay. Now if I want to get fancier, I can make another copy of this. I can come down here and create another virtual copy. So I've got a third copy. So let me backtrack. The first one, I just did a little color temperature on the face. This is my original one. Number 2, I'm darkening for the dress so I can have some detail in there, and I use the exposure module. A lot of times photographers will ask us regarding what's the difference between the brightness and the exposure. Well, many times on the exposure, it's kind of a global, it's the overall. If I double click this, it's the overall effect. Usually a brightness kind of controls just the bright areas of the image. So if you test it, either one, I think this might even do a little better job on the exposure on the dress, but look what it's doing to the face. Okay, so that's why you'll see in a few minutes how this works. So the dress looks great here. So I'm gonna go back and you keep the brightness instead of the global because I want to maintain the brightness overall. Now here's number 3. Now number 3 is a copy of number 2. But in this case, I want to kind of do a little darkening here. I want to do a little overall darkening in this image. So I can literally now take the exposure down like this. See what I'm doing here? So basically what I'm doing is I'm darkening almost like a vignette around this whole image. Now the difference is that, again, going back, this is the original. This is where I'm just darkening for the dress, and then this is where I'm actually darkening this whole area here. Now if I wanted to, I could make a 4th one. If I came back to here, if I wanted to make another copy of any of these, I can go here and enhance colors. I can add vibrance. I can add clarity on a separate layer. So this is allowing me options I never had in Lightroom to keep building on certain items and certain effects. And now later on, I can now apply this through the perfect layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight all 3 layers, which I'm holding down the Shift key and all 3. And what you do is you go under your File menu, and this is where the perfect layer is sitting. You go under File, Plug-in Extras, and then you click on Perfect Layers. Now obviously I'm working with the whole onOne suite, so at the end I'll try to show you 1 or 2 quick features from there, but in this case I now want to work with those 3 layers that I'm working with. Okay, so what it's going to do is you notice it's going to now take those images, all 3 of those images, and it's going to export that into a separate window. And inside the window you'll notice Make sure that we're right in there. There we go. Okay, now I'm in perfect layers. So now you'll notice a couple things here. Okay, you'll notice it's got its own window now. You're now inside perfect layers, which is obviously launched as we just did. You'll also notice here on the right-hand side you've got your navigating window, so you can obviously see what the image is. And underneath here is your layers. Now, one question I got from another colleague photographer is that, well, is this the section where you're going to get to maybe add more color, or you're going to add any effects? Well, certainly you've got a few options in here, but the reason you saw the effects I did in Lightroom, which was either darkening perhaps, there's some in a couple minutes you'll see where the other one where I'm going to enhance more colors. This is where now if I toggle off, you see I've got 3 different layers. These are the 3 different files that came in. That's the first one. That's the second one, and that's the third one. Now you can, if you only brought one image in, I'm going to just go to the original, you can also make a copy here. So if I am on this base layer, let's say you brought in only a single photo, you can hit copy and it will give you an extra copy. And then you'll see demonstrations of where we also have the blend modes. So with that you're allowed to start making some effects here. But in my case, I'm trying to add some of the coloring, some of the darkening, some other effects that Lightroom offers us, and now I can apply that with a brush. So you see all 3 layers. Let's go there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this layer off because I only want to manage this layer. This was the layer that we talked about where I obviously worked on the dress. So let's go back just so you can have a view of that. That's the original photo. I did a little color temperature on the base photo. That was fine. And I did a little exposure on the face. I thought the face was great exposure, but now if I darken this in Lightroom, the face darker, then this got dark. In other words, it's backwards. If I darken the dress, then this got dark. So the second one allowed me to go to the dress. Now here's your next step. Here's your major feature of the masking. If you go over to the next section, which is masking, you'll notice you have some brush options. Over on the top left-hand side, you'll notice you have a brush tool right here. You click that one, and you now have an active brush. So in this case, you have options. What am I going to do with this brush? Well, I want to actually paint out areas back from the original, which is underneath there. So here you've got tabs of either painting out, painting in, your options. So in this case, I want to paint out sections I don't want. So if I paint out like her face, because I don't want, remember I don't want the face any darker, but I want to keep the dress. So I can come in here and then just paint that out. And I'm doing this kind of quickly here. And so you can see now that I've kept the exposure from the dress. And certainly I use a Wacom tablet, so I'm doing this a little bit quickly for you, but with a nice brush, you can sit here and do this. Now, Bill, you notice the difference here real quick between the first series and here? If you come over here, you make sure your opacity is adjusted accordingly. You can adjust the opacity on your brush. So for me in this case, I really was going for 100% to remove. Obviously, every time you keep clicking on the brush, it's going to keep adding a little bit extra, but if you're at 100%, so I'll do the same thing. I'm taking out all the areas, in this case, I don't want dark for right now, okay? And especially we're just going for the dress. And that's pretty much what I'm doing with most of my wedding dresses. And I'm making sure, and I'm just doing this kind of sloppy here, so bear with me, guys. So I'm doing it pretty quick here. And certainly if you made a mistake and you want to paint in, and you want to be, like here by the, you can do the same thing and paint some of that in and vice versa. But a lot of times, this is stuff that I can, as I do usually either in Photoshop, which takes a lot longer for me, but remember this is all non-destructive effect. I want to make sure that I'm getting it as best as possible. And again, I'm doing this kind of a little bit sloppier here, but just to show you that effect. Actually, I want to get the veil a little bit wider here, so let's work on the veil. Okay. So now, let's go to this. The next section is I did an overall darkening to it. But I'm happy with this, meaning if I didn't need to add a third layer, by the way, if the only effect that I wanted to do on here, and again, I'm just doing this real quickly there. Usually I would follow through with my brush a little bit more accurately. So the thing is that if I want, people ask me, do you need 3 layers, 1 layer, 2 layers, etc.? Well, I could have just left this alone. I could have said, you know what, I just want to darken the dress down, and I'm okay with that. So that's usually up to your taste as you're designing your images, which route you want to go. Now remember, I've got that other layer, which is now my darker layer. So you're wondering, well, why do we need this? Well, you know, this is again a matter of your choice. A lot of times I like to bring the center of attention to the face, the couple, in this case the bride. I don't want the attention to come down to the dress. I'm always doing a lot of darkening. So by adding this effect globally, same thing. I have the same option of going under the mask tab, selecting paint out, because there's certain areas that I want to paint out. In this case, it's at 100%. I probably want to start maybe at around 10%, maybe 20%. I don't want it too noticeable because I want it to blend softly. And that's the key thing about when you're working with brushes, is you don't want to just do everything at 100%. If I hit the Command or Control Z, I'm able to go back. I'm just showing you what it looks like. If I came in here with it at 100%, it's pretty obvious, right? So if I come in this case, 15, 20%, and I build it, I slowly build kind of where I want to go. Another secret about my enhancements is that, you know, I have, you obviously weren't with me on the photo shoot, but this is some window light coming in from the left to the right. A lot of times I'll play little tricks here, and I will only illuminate the certain areas, and I can actually accentuate more shading on this side as well. And I'm clicking a couple of times to kind of slowly build this up. But on some of the really low-key photos that I do, obviously you got to be careful, don't get too much shading. I can kind of keep some of that texture on there. In other words, like more of the light coming through there. And I'll usually let this gradually come down. As I click around here slowly, I'll kind of keep that a little darker, just so that the attention is coming right to the subject. And so as I'm just slowly working around slowly, a lot of times I won't even do it. I'm just painting certain areas. If I know the light, if I want to add an effect like a spotlight, sometimes I'll just slowly, and see, I can come over here and change the feathering on my brush. So if I want a little bit softer of a brush so it's not so pronounced, I can do that as well. Okay. Sometimes I'll pick a direction, like there's a direction of light as I'm painting. So this is why the layers is so important to me, because I want to paint certain things in. And I'm doing this a little quickly for you. But in the same token, I have the freedom of doing that. I can paint. A lot of the images I work on everything is not just globally added to it. Everything that I do is just painted in so it looks like an effect. And if I still want to have a little bit more, if I think that I've kind of overdone that, see, I can still come back and with layers. That's what made, I guess, that we want to say Photoshop famous, is because they're masks and layers, and allowing digital artists to paint in effects and not necessarily going with that global effect. So just adding mood to my images is really what this is allowing me to do. And it almost looks like I'm using multiple lights now because of the certain vignetting style that I'm adding here. And if I want to keep detail in the hair, come back here at 100%, just paint in that area. So those of you who are very familiar with using masks, this now allows us, Photoshop / now Lightroom users, the extra tool that we can do there. So that's the reason. And you also have the opacity. So if you think here on that slider back under your Layers tab, if you just want to gradually do that, I still have that control. Now the beauty of this, let's get out of this one. The beauty of this is now when I hit save, this should return my results back into Lightroom. So if I still want to add a little bit of color, as you notice it's going to go through, it's telling Lightroom these are the enhancements that are being made, and it's going to take those images, those 3 images, and bring them back into Lightroom. And if I still want to make some tweaks on it, which again is considered a raw file, it's going to now make it a PSD, just to be technical for it. Let's see if we can find that here. Okay, there we go. Here we go, right there. See, it's got a little arrow right there. There's your image that we just created. So if you notice here, it's now a PSD file. If I come down here and kind of show that to you, see that there? The original one was a CR2, and now it's created a PSD for us, okay? So that's the cool thing about it. So now, if I still wanted to come in here and make some enhancements, if I wanted to add a little clarity to this, you know, obviously I can do any approach. I still have that freedom of using any of your Lightroom tools. And now here's the best part of this. Let's say you're finished with this. You're totally okay with this. At this point, you can now edit into Photoshop, okay? And that's important to me. And I'm going to edit the original. You can have options of editing a copy, with Lightroom adjustments. You can edit just a copy, and you certainly edit the original. So one of the great things here is that when we get into Photoshop is, let's click on there. Let's make sure we find the Photoshop window. Let's minimize this. There we go. I'm going to do this so we can see where we're at. Let's make sure I'm in the Photoshop window here. There we go. Thank you. There we go. All right. So look over here on the right-hand side. Every one of those effects that I added is now fully editable. And that's what's great for me. I thought for sure that this was going to just be locked in, everything that I did in Lightroom, because here's this. If you're a Lightroom user and you did editing in the past before this perfect layers, and you brought that into Photoshop, there was no more layers. Your clarity wasn't on a layer, your exposure wasn't on a layer, your coloring, any effects you did in Lightroom only never came into Photoshop in a layer. So now any of these effects, whether I added 5 or 10, whatever effects, I now have, with perfect layers, these effects. Now, why is that important to me? Because this is now fully editable. I can use a brush tool in Photoshop. If I change my mind about something, come up here to the opacity area. You remember you got the same option up here on the opacity to move and adjust. I'm going to exaggerate 100%. And look at that. I can make total changes, which I don't want that, but I can make total changes on any layer. If I want to clean up around the area, see that? Remember earlier we did that? I can clean up in those areas. So this is, if you're using it as much as I do, I'm pretty much working on this 24/7, well, at least 7 days a week. This has opened my eyes because, again, there's a lot of great presets that I've added. There's presets that I've built in Lightroom, and I'd love to add these effects. But the problem is with Lightroom by itself, I could never do that because it would come out globally, and or unless I paint it in with the adjustment brushes in Lightroom. But now any effects I still have editable inside Lightroom and now in Photoshop. So for me, again, not using this as long as it's been out, I mean, obviously it's just been introduced, but in my mind I knew, you know what, this gave me extra control that I never had before, because I have a lot of cool adjustments that I can do back into Lightroom, and I could never do them because I knew that it would take a little bit extra work. Okay, so there's your image for the first part, and then I'm going to take you over to show you another image of actually doing a composite. But again, that's the beauty of this. So I'm going to just X this out because we don't want to save that. And certainly if you have questions, you can send those over to Brian. So let's get back into Lightroom, and let's work on another image for you. Now this next image is a lot of images that I do. I do some composites. I like to add like skies and backgrounds. Sometimes I'll add another image to backgrounds, and so obviously we're all used to doing this masking and enhancements in Photoshop. But again, if you're a power Lightroom user, you want to maximize the raw files as much as possible. And in this case, that's what I'm doing. So in this case, let's go over and select this image here. And this is another raw file. And this is a typical image that I work with. This is an image where I may not had looking for a sunset at the time. I may not have been looking for anything, clouds at the time. Usually when I'm doing an engagement photograph in this type of images, I'll just show you one or two. I'm looking for expressions at the time. I'm working the poses. I'm making sure that is important. I mean, photography for me is important as a first. I want to make sure my exposures look great, expressions, everything else involved. So when I get to an image like this, it's basically now with having all these tools available to me, it's like, wow, what can I do now to these images? So with the onOne suite, those of you who've watched any of my webinars, you'll notice that I've opened up the onOne suite, and with a couple of products like Photo Frame, Photo Tools, I'll take you in there before we close to show you a little finishing of that. It allows me to kind of be more creative, and certainly my clients see this, by the way, when I do an engagement session. And for those of you who certainly are making a living at photography, if you only gave them your clients images like this, certainly they're thinking they could just take that and print on their own. So that's why I always go out of my way to create a unique image, create something different, create something that they couldn't do themselves. And so that's why as a photographer and an artist, this gives me freedom to have like a digital darkroom that I can create and make my images have more impact than what they could do on their own. So let's work on this image here. This is a image, it's a raw file, and same thing. On this image, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little bit of enhancements on this one. This is my base photo. Certainly with color temperature, same thing. I'll make sure that the images are warm. I'm actually just looking at the skin tone, by the way, right now. I'm not worried about the sky or anything. I'm just worried about the skin tone. Make sure the skin is not too warm. Same thing with exposure. I'm going to work on the exposures here. I can kind of do the same thing here. I can kind of darken, I can lighten. So in this case, I'm just working on the exposure of the people, okay, not the background. So remember we talked about earlier, let's add one more effect on there just as we do the same minor process we did earlier. Let's go under, you right click on the image and you click on that create virtual copy. So there's copy number 2. So remember we talked about the sky, we talked about that. Let's kind of bring the exposure down on that. Okay, it's kind of the same effect we just did earlier. Obviously the people are getting a little bit darker, but we know what we can do there in a few minutes. So I can bring that down, add a little effect to it. I'm just darkening that overall one. So there's 2 images. Now the third image is now I've done 2 options with me. I can either, I can either add color to the background. I can add more clouds. But in this case, what I did is during the same photo shoot, this is what I took a picture of. As I looked up in the sky, these birds were flying through, and I said, wow, that's pretty cool. I said, let me get a photo of that. And I just wanted that for my library. I collect, textures. I collect scenics. I collect different backgrounds. So I really had no idea that I was going to use it for that. But in this case, I am. So again, I'm going to use the base layer, which is just an exposure and color temperature adjustment. Second one, I want to just darken the sky a little bit. So I want to be able to go back and edit that. And then the third one is I want to add this image to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this first one. Hold down the command or shift key, command or control key, and I'm going to select these 3, okay? So I've selected those 3, and what we did earlier is we're going to go under File menu, because now we want to bring this into Perfect Layers, because I want to merge these images together. So what I've done is I'll select this. It'll behind the scenes, as you notice up here on top, it's now going to take those 3 images, 3 raw files, and place those on their own layer in Perfect Layers. So let's go down here in the bottom. Let's make sure that's our front screen. So there's what we have so far. What looks like a half of a sky, half of a picture. So we're going to go through each one. Okay. So here's your tools on this side, by the way. So I'll give you a little quick explanation. Certainly this first one is kind of an easy one. It's your move tool. If you just leave the mouse hovering over there for a second. This allows me to move my layers around. So it's fully editable. Just because I'm working on it right now, I can certainly do this later on. This kind of makes it look like the birds are flying, doesn't it? So anyway, so that allows me to move any of my layers. Okay, so again, this first layer I can adjust this kind of any way I want. If you hold down the little corners here, you can kind of move this around as well. So if you want to make the adjustments a little bit more, you can do that. Now with this kind of image, I'm going to hit Control or Command minus, so I can kind of what we do in Photoshop, right, to kind of bring the image in. And I can still, even though this is an abstract type image, I can kind of play with this any way I want. So there's your first layer, which as you can see here. So I guess what's usually, I'm going to click back here on this brush, but usually what's recommended for us, if you click on this layer, which it happens to be, let's see, that's your sky. So if you click on there, I can actually title that sky, right? I think that helps. And then I'm going to turn this off, and then I'm going to go to the second one, and that's the one we did the sky. We kind of darkened the sky. So we're going to call this the dark sky. This just helps us, same thing, because if you build some with multiple layers, this helps you, because later on you're wondering, well, which is the ones that I was working on? And then certainly down below, that's your base layer. So certainly we can leave that alone, or of course you can call that your original. Okay, so you'll know that's the one that came in from Lightroom. Okay, there we go. Hold on, actually I'm going to put master copy. I want to do that just so I know. There we go. Let's call that the master copy. So there we go. Let me turn on back those layers. So you'll see that we brought all those 3 layers in. So we're going to do exactly what we did last time. I changed from the move tool to the brush tool. That's what I did a few seconds ago. They also talked about this tool, which basically allows us to clip out certain areas. So literally in a few minutes I'll demonstrate that I can actually just trim out everything around this section if I only wanted to keep just the birds. But we'll get to that trim tool in a second. In this case, I'm going to use the brush because we're going to paint in and out. Certainly you've got also a move tool that's just letting us move your image around the canvas here. So let's go back and start with the brush tool. And let's start from the base layer here. We're going to start from this dark sky. I'm going to work with the birds last. Another feature that is great here that allowed us to do is now, let's say for some reason I wanted to do the opposite. I wanted to put the dark, I can change this by putting the dark sky on top just by clicking and hold down and drag it on top of it. And some images I may want to do that because I may just want to paint out this front layer and just reveal only the birds. So you can certainly do that as well. Okay. So in other words, if I hit paint out, I'm in the dark sky, and let's make our brush, I'm holding the bracket keys here, or you can come to your brush size here, either way. And basically, if I wanted to, is make sure the opacity, that says paint in, make sure I'm paint out. Brush size, I'm at opacity. So see that? I can actually just paint in some of the birds, or in this case, I'm painting out the dark sky layer. So that's an option of masking here, and I'm just doing this rather quickly. Okay, that's one option of changing those, put that dark sky on top of that sky. Okay, now if I prefer not to do that, okay, let's reset that mask. Let's go back my first approach. That's one option. Let's go back like we did earlier. I'm going to work on this dark sky. So we want to paint out the areas, because remember we did a darkening of the whole image in Lightroom. So I'm going to paint out. I'm going to keep my opacity probably at about 50%. I can come back and lower my brush size. Take a look at it there. It just shows you a little sample. And this is where I want to kind of now brush out the areas that I didn't want to darken. Okay, so if I didn't want to darken them out, let's give it a little bit more opacity here. Then obviously I can now come in and now paint that out, that whole effect. So once again, that allows me to use several options in Lightroom that I wasn't able to do before, and I'd have to just wait to go back into Photoshop. This one allows me to work in Lightroom, make my adjustments, and obviously go take this back into Lightroom as a PSD. I'm just removing, remember, some of those areas that I didn't want, removing that. And the opacity I went to 100%, lower the brush size, and this you got to do very carefully. So if you have a Wacom tablet with a brush, it's a lot easier. You can go through here a little bit finer, but I'm just doing this a little quickly for us. All right, so there's your layer there. That's your dark sky layer, now allowing us to show and reveal only the darkness and keep this here. Now let's enter into our next layer, which is the sky. So here's another fantastic part inside Perfect Layers that we are glad to see that is one of their tools, is your blending mode right here on your right hand side. Now this generally we had to wait to get into Photoshop. If you are using the onOne suite, and this is the same product that is used inside most of them, like the photo frame, we can go in and make some blending options. So you can basically tap down through these and take a look to see what effects it does. If I do an overlay, you can see that it just very gently puts the birds kind of in the background. Certainly if you want the sky in there, you're kind of going through each one of these to see what effect you actually want in here. Okay. So as I toggle through each of these, I'm kind of picking the effect that I want. And in this case, I'll probably go down to, I'm going to do a multiply, and I'll tell you why. The overlay mode is another great option we do. It's a little bit softer. You can see the birds kind of just shaded a little bit. But if I want them a little bit more pronounced, sometimes I'll go with a hard light. Now the only other difference that there's another sample I made of this one the other night, is that I actually turned the image in Lightroom into black and white, this base or sky into black and white, so that if you notice that this image for me kind of has a monochromatic dark sky, so I really wasn't trying to put a fake sunny sky in there for that part, because certainly it would look kind of a bit too fake there. I wanted to go with that darker mood. So in this case what I did was I either went black and white, or in this case I can either go multiply and kind of tone some of that down. You also have, remember earlier we have the opacity. So by dropping the opacity, that'll kind of soften that up for me a little bit. And same thing applies here. We're on this layer, the sky layer. We want to paint out certain areas. Now this is the other part, is where we want to have slowly remove things. I think that's a key to a lot of these blending, is that we never want to just start at that 100%. Many times, again, I'm at 10, 20%, and I can slowly build into this here. I can slowly build into it as I make it look more natural. But if you just go ahead and do 100% every time, and I can just slowly brush into this and just slowly do that. Now, the areas that I want a little bit more aggressively, which is usually around the subject, is then I will then come back, and any hard lines, I'll come back, especially around the people, and then I'll start adjusting my brush at that point. I'll come in here definitely 100% around them and make sure I'm painting that out, okay? Making sure I get as many of that as I can. Hold on a second. Painting as much of that out as I can. See, as I'm kind of bringing that in there, okay? And the cool thing too is that if I, at any given time, if I still want to adjust this, I can still come up here and move this around. See, as you can see where it's sent to my mask, I can still move this around. Okay, so at any given time you still have that option, but I'm just slowly blending it in. You notice what it's doing here, this progress, it's saving this information back into Lightroom for you. So that's the beauty of this, is that's always saving that for us. So again, as I go through here and just slowly soften, this would take a little bit of time as you kind of go through here a little bit. And again, just varying my opacity. Certainly you can spend tons of time doing that, but I'm going to kind of leave it like this just for a meantime, just so you can kind of see what I'm doing. Of course, let me just back up here. I want to make sure I don't get rid of that too much. And there we go. All right, so I'm just doing this quickly for us. I want to get rid of some of this, just because what I'm going to do in a few seconds is I have two options. I can still keep working this blend mode like this. You see, I can still come back on that layer, make my changes. There you go, see? So that's where the trick is that you're blending. I'm blending from top to bottom. I'm changing the opacity in that section. So when you're starting to play with all this, if the blending mode didn't work perfectly like you wanted it, you can still slowly paint in this effect. So the last thing I'm going to just do, I'm going to make sure I'm at 100%. Bring my brush down a little smaller here. You can notice you can bring that down here. I'm using the bracket keys, and just make sure it's always, my faces aren't getting affected, and their bodies, of course. Make sure that stays that way. All right, so we're done here, this part. We've got all three layers merged together, and all we're going to do is hit save. And this is the best part, because now it's going to take all three adjustments, all three layers, save those. It creates a composite image for me and puts me right back into Lightroom. And now you'll see how I can now make my effect. Now the bonus on this image is I'm going to take this and show you a little existing feature in the onOne suite, how this is all merges together. So let's go into Lightroom and let's look for that PSD. Make sure there it is as it pops in there. See that little arrow right there? So let's click on our PSD, and there you go. So you've got those images merged together. I've got this non-destructive image in front of me. Again, I have all my features in Lightroom. If you guys are like preset fanatics like I am, I collect and build all kinds of presets. These are the Adobe ones, but I've got my own series that I put together. But as you just toggle through these, I can apply any of these effects at any given time. I'm going to click on the split tone. Take a look at that. So several effects that you can do. But what I'm going to do now is I'm pretty happy with this at this point. Certainly I can still add tons of more features, but to keep it brief, because you can probably get, I can spend an hours on my images. I'm going to bring this into Lightroom now. Okay, so I'm going to select the image. I'm going to right click, and basically I'm going to edit into Photoshop in this case. I want to edit the original. I'm going to hit edit, and it's going to bring me into Photoshop. And once again, there's our layers, okay? All fully editable. I can make any changes to them. I can remove them. I can change opacities of them. I have tons of other options on this image. So the last couple steps I like to do is, because I do work a lot with the onOne suite, I've got all these features in here. So usually that's kind of what I'm doing. I believe my webinar tomorrow will talk specifically about adding these enhancements using photo frame, photo tools, and focal point. But for now, I'm going to use photo frame. So in this case, what I'm going to do, I've got all these effects here, right? So many times I'll save this on there on my in my client's file. I'll save this image as is, by the way. I'll stop right here. I'll do a save as. I'll save this as a PSD in their file, and then if I need to go back and work on that and fine tune it, I will. So once I saved it, usually I'll make myself that copy of it, and in this case I'll flatten this image and just keep it intact, and knowing that this could be a duplicate. So if I have the PSD in the folder, I'll make a duplicate of that PSD and bring it back into Photoshop. I just like to do that. This is my little quirky thing, because I may add effects and later on I like the original one, and then I don't want to go back and forth, because a lot of times I'm adding so many effects and layers that, number one, if my Photoshop crashes or something, you know, I'd hate to start all over again. So I always save that PSD right away, put that away, make sure that I did all that work, and then maybe I'll make a second copy. So many of my images, believe it or not, I'll have like 3 or 4 copies before I get to that end result. So that's just a little workflow tip that I use, just because I did a lot of work and I don't want it to crash on me and add 30 layers here in front of me, and then next thing you know, you've got that error in front of you that says there's an unexpected error has occurred. That's not a good day. Okay, so let's finish this printout. So now what I'll do is I'll hit Control or Command J, and of course what that is if you just drag basically this image down to here, that's in a shortcut. It'll let you copy it. I just made another copy, which is fine. So you can just, as long as you make a copy. Then I'm going to go into photo frame, and as I believe correctly, your perfect layers will eventually, once it's released, will be docked in here. So those of you who watch me do my webinars on this know that this is the beauty of the onOne software, which again in the future, once this is released, it'll still be docked in here. So that's why I love the Lightroom. I love Photoshop. I love working with the onOne because it's all integrated. I don't have to go to a third party and try to launch a separate thing half the time. It's all here. So just a couple quick things I like to use. So this image, I'm going to use photo frame. And there's a lot of my images I love photo frame. It's not necessarily because I'm putting frames around my images. It's because I like some of their backgrounds. I love some of their textures. You can see these awesome textures in here. Take a look at this one here. I'm just going to do that just to look at it, just because it looked cool when I saw it. Take a look at this one and look at that cool frame around there. So it's kind of endless, everything that you do. Let me get by. You notice here it's got also its own layers. Whatever feature or tools you add, it's got its own layers. So in this case, let me get rid of that here. I want to go back and show you what I was really looking for in their tools. I'm going to hit minus. It's got rid of it, and let's open the library. This is where originally I wanted to show you. If you're familiar with the onOne products, you know that in the photo frames and several, there's many choices. I always invite everybody to click on them, go through them, practice with them. There's hundreds of them. In this case, I use this textured layers just to add effect on there. And one of my favorite ones, there's many that are my favorite, but I use this paper effect just to kind of break things up. Composites work great when you have multiple layers, and it helps blend the images together, not just looks like you just slapped a photo on there. So this paper one right here is the one that I use. Now, you notice down here it says frame background. You have an option of putting a white coating on that. In other words, it turns a white effect, as I probably want to call it. I want to use the black, so you have that option. If you tune in tomorrow or go to iTunes and look for my webinar on using photo frames, I talk about this step by step. But in this case, I'm going to choose that, and all I have to do is hit Add Frame. And you notice there's that awesome effect on there. Now I've blended everything together in my world. I've blended the backgrounds together. And in this case, I have options of either still, you've got blending modes, just like in perfect layers. I can cycle through here, change any of these that I'd like. So you have those options. If I want to wait till I get into Photoshop, you notice here on the left-hand side, there's that texture. See that? It's added that right on top of there. See, the great thing with the photo frames, it's got such a huge library. I don't have to surf for it. It's there in one click for me. Secondly, it resizes it to my file. I don't have to sit there and worry, is it enough resolution of that texture? So I can go on and on how that's developed. So in this case, I'm going to select this. I'm going to hit Apply. It'll return the result. It's in the background. It's sizing it up. It's sizing that texture for us, and it's going to apply it on its separate layer right on top of this image. So as you see, there that is. Now the beauty of anything that onOne is built for us is that it's on its separate layer. So you notice that it's sitting here, the one that says texture paper. Okay, so you have that option. So once again, I have all my blending modes here. Okay, so you can work with that. You still have that option. And then, of course, if I want to edit it off of the people, in this case, let me just zoom in here. I want to remember the texture here. I want to add a mask by clicking here. You don't usually want to hit like the erase tool. A lot of people ask me, can I just erase that? Well, you can, but it's not editable. So by using a mask, by just clicking on this icon, and make sure you select it on this layer, click on that mask. And now in this case, I'll basically get your brush tool here. Okay, right here's your off your tool. Hit your brush tool. And then of course, I like to work with, remember, the different opacities. So in this case, 100% is only going to be probably just on the faces and the areas that I want to work with, because I'm just trying to get rid of some of that texture. And again, I'm kind of doing this a little quickly, but you want to be a little precision. Again, if you're able to use a brush, it's a little bit more precision. I'm just doing this a little quickly for us. Unless you guys all want to spend an hour with me, I'd love to hang out with this. And by the way, that's another comment I make to photographers that we all laugh about, because I know that a lot of this is truly about speed. And certainly you can see I did this rather quickly, so that is certainly a bonus for any of these products, and that's why we welcome the third-party products into Photoshop and Lightroom, because it is about speed. I don't want to spend hours, and I've got production staff trying to do that, and certainly the other secret to this is I can replicate this. I can duplicate this. I don't have to spend hours in Photoshop creating my textures and effects. If I want to apply this, if a client says, hey, Frank, I love that picture on the wall, can you make me one like that? I know I could do the exact same thing, and so these tools help me. So once again, I've erased it off of them, and make sure, again, this is all up to you guys. You can certainly do that. Another tool that you can do here is, you see how this mask is on here? You can basically come up to this section, and usually what I'll do is I'll click on this. This is a shortcut I have to, if I hit a Command or Control I, you see what I just did there? It's Command or Control I, basically, or you can go up to select here and hit inverse. That's what I'm doing. I'm just inversing the mask. The opposite thing applied. So Command or Control I, and the brush would let me do the same effect here. Is I can now paint in the texture. Make sure that your foreground color is the opposite of the mask, which is supposed to be white. So you want to click on the white. Hold on a second. You click on this little arrow here. It toggles it. And see, then I can paint in the texture. So that's one other shortcut that you can do. Okay. But in my case, I left it so I wanted texture over the whole thing. So there is, now I think you guys, I'm going to add one more effect. You guys ready? Okay. I'll have to add one more. So that's the effect there. Okay. I'm going to add one more effect just because I like to do that. The other little secret, again, if you're going to watch this other webinars I do, if I can darken this area a little bit, one of my favorite effects, this just takes a couple seconds here, is I'll go back into photo frame. Let's make sure we're here. And same thing, I'm still building it. This is, again, you don't have to add all this stuff. You know, after doing so many for myself every day, it's like, you know what, I'm always coming up with something different. So I'm going to go back to this texture overlay, and I wanted to add a little bit more mood to it. You see how I'm using a cloud effect? You see how the clouds, to me, clouds are kind of like a vignetting effect. But you can click pretty much through any of these, and you can kind of look at, certainly we've already added some kind of texture to it. I've used some of these harder effects on here, but many times if I want just a little bit more darkening effect, like vignetting to me, or spotting around images, I'll pick one of, maybe like a cloud. I'll pick on this top right one here. And you guys probably think I'm a little nuts here, but I'll show you what I've done is I have two options we said earlier. I can do multiply, screen, any of these that I feel that will add that effect to me. And it'll just kind of add a little shading in there, so you have that option. But I'll show you what I do many times. I'll leave this normal, leave it alone. You see up here on your top, you've got the clouds, okay, on this effect. And I'll hit apply, and this will bring me back into Photoshop. Here we go. Again, it's resizing it on its own. It's telling Photoshop the dimension of the image, the resolution, everything's there. Let me close this out. You remember, here we are back on that section. Well, in this case, same thing. You have all your blend modes, so you can cycle through tons of these if you want to use any of these images. I like this soft light, but a lot of times is I'll do that mask like I did earlier, but this time what I'll do is I'll hold down the Alt key when I hold this down. You see when you if you click on Add Mask, it'll put a white mask. But if I hold down the Alt key, which is my favorite shortcut, it'll put a black mask. Whoops. hold on, let's do it on the layer, the one that we want. Do it again. Hold down Alt key, Option key Alt, click on the black mask. Now with my brush, select the brush, probably come in same thing, not every effect. I may want to do it about 30–40%. Make sure, since we have a black mask, you want to make sure your foreground color is in white over here in this section. Remember, you can toggle back and forth. And basically, I can come in here and just add any type of effect that I want. I'm just painting in certain spots to make it just look like a painting, like it wasn't just so put together. And so just by adding, just look at that, just adding just a little bit in there adds that color. I mean, I don't have to go crazy, but it's just adding a little, you know, the reason I like the clouds is because I could do this with a brush, but the brush is just a round tool. I can change some of that, but it looks round. These clouds are adding just this mottled effect like it's painting. So that's the reason I'm using clouds, metal backgrounds, wood backgrounds. I want it so that the viewer looks at the image and says, wow, how'd they do that? It doesn't look like it's just a round brush. So there you go. That's our image, and it's going to save however you want to save. You want to save it as a JPEG TIFF from Photoshop, and there you go. That's your quick, perfect layers. And hopefully you guys learned a couple tips. I can go on forever, as you can see. But any questions, please funnel those over to Brian. And again, I hope you all enjoyed something. But I truly am enjoying layers because I love Lightroom, and certainly all of us Photoshop fanatics know that we want to create a non-destructive effect, meaning that we don't want to work on JPEGs. We want to keep the file in its true integrity without pixelating or banning, etc. That's the kind of partial reason we work on RAW files. So again, I think it's a great tool for Lightroom lovers, and I'm glad to have it a part of the onOne suite. So Brian, I'll send it back to you, and once again, my name is Frank Salas. Thank you for listening.
Hey, Frank, thank you so much. I'm going to take over for a few minutes and just go over. There were a few questions that came through just generally around perfect layers, and I'd like to just spend a few minutes going over them, Frank. The one question that I think I fielded pretty much every question for you, but there was one question that someone asked more about workflow and your Lightroom workflow. Do you typically do any like lens correction or white balance adjustments with your images before you start working on them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's usually, and you know, and without trying to go over too much time, you know, I certainly do a whole Lightroom workflow on how I prepare the image. But I think the two key things I do in Lightroom, as you saw, is that color balance, your color temperature. That's always the first thing I do. I want to make sure skin tone is the right colors, and then certainly the exposure, right? That's just the second main thing. Make sure my exposure looks great, and that's how I usually will convert out my JPEG. So if I'm shooting RAW, I convert a JPEG out, very neutral. But I don't add my effects yet because I'm just showing my client that I guess I don't want to call it unfinished, but just a very neutral JPEG of my work. And then later on, I can come back into Lightroom once they select that image they want. Then I can go crazy and add lens correction, clarity, or whatever. Then you can do that. But I think in today's market, on a side note, is I don't want to give my client something that looks that great yet, in the sense that you know, they'll say, why are we paying so much more for your wall portraits? You know, why do you want so much more for the albums? Well, because I'm going to add all this artwork, and if it looked really easy, like I just threw it in during my workflow, that doesn't look very like I did much work to it. But if they see what I do later like this, there's a value to it, because number one, they can't get that done at a warehouse store if they send it to get printed. But if you did it so easy in Lightroom all day just for their proofing, then it certainly makes it look like it's too easy for them. So I always invite you to decide, you know, which way you want to present your image.
Right. Once I was just answering a question. Okay. Frank, I don't want to keep you because there are a few things I want to do.
Okay.
You're welcome to stay. I just want to show some information about perfect layers,
Sure.
and then I'm going to give everyone. There are a few people that asked about how to learn more about you, so I want to. I have that information for everyone as well. So, guys, if you want to stay on the line for another couple of minutes, I have some more kind of functionality stuff I'd like to discuss as part of the questions that you guys sent me. All right, I'm going to take over control, Frank. Just bear with me one second.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, no, thank you. Make me presenter. Let me just verify that my screen shows up. Okay, so you guys should see my screen. The first question I want to tackle is, why doesn't aperture work, or why doesn't perfect layers work in aperture? So right now, the fully baked-in support of Aperture will not be there until the final version, but does not mean that you can't currently use perfect layers within Aperture. So I've got Aperture over here. I've got this image. It's a stock image that we picked up, and the way you can get perfect layers to work within Aperture is this. And again, Aperture is an Apple-only product. You go to Aperture, you go to Preferences, and you're going to select this Export button. And the first field that says External Photo Editor, you'll hit Choose, and then go to the folder that contains perfect layers, and then go to the perfect layers icon, and then hit Select. And I'm working with 8-bit PSD files that you can select a 16-bit if you want, or a TIFF file, but it's going to be a PSD no matter what. And then if you choose, I profile my displays, as you can see, so I'm working off of my 24-inch display profile with a color monkey. That's the profile that I select. Once you do that, what we can do is I'm going to take this image, and I'm going to kind of follow a similar technique that Frank showed earlier. I'm going to take this image, I'm going to go to the Photos menu, and I'm going to go to Duplicate Version. So this is the equivalent of making a virtual copy in Lightroom. So we've got 2 copies. Now I'm going to drop my saturation and bump up my contrast and bump up the definition a bit. So I've got 2 different versions of my image here. If I select both of them and I go to Photos, you'll see Edit with Perfect Layers will appear in your menu. I'm going to select Edit with Perfect Layers. I'm going to hit Close to the slides, and here are our 2 layers. You can see kind of like what Frank said, I renamed this to black and white, and then this one I'll rename to color. Now I've got my 2 images, and now I can select a blending mode, for instance. As you highlight them, you'll see different options. So like overlay looks pretty cool. And if it's overall too much of a look, just drop the opacity to reveal the underlying color layer. But I like it kind of punchy. And then I can use a layer mat, or the layer brush, not the layer brush, the masking brush rather. I'm going to drop the opacity and boost up the feathering, because I like that kind of soft transition that Frank was also talking about. And just kind of in a few different strokes, return some of that original skin tone back. Now if I go to File, Save, here actually, and while I'm in here, a few things. First, some people ask, well, can we do JPEGs or TIFFs? Yes, except it's not under the Save menu. It's under the Export menu. So if you go to Export, you can select to save it as a JPEG or a TIFF file. And you can choose the file name and the destination. If you go to File, Save, this will actually update the PSD file that's created. So I'll hit Save. And if I go back to, I'm going to close Perfect Layers, you can see that Aperture updated the that image. Now what happens in Aperture, and this is going to be something that we're going to work on, is let's say I sent 2 images to excuse me, to Perfect Layers. It makes duplicate copies of those 2 images. So if I sent 4 images, you would have 8 images total. What this just means is I select these 2 images, I right click, and I go to excuse me, delete versions. So what I'm left with is my original image and my composited blended image. And that's how you can get Perfect Layers to work in Aperture right now. Going down the line, it's going to be automated as part of the installer, and it's going to be more seamless with the final version. Another couple of questions. I'm going to go here. I did this example before. This is a what we call a motor drive sequence, where I have these 4 images that I took at Universal Studios. So I'm going to select all 4 of them. I'm going to go to File. Oh, actually, you know what? Let's do it this way. For those of you that are not Lightroom or Aperture users, let's go. This process will be the same whether you are on a Mac or a PC. Except on a PC, instead of going to your Applications folder, you'll go to your Program Files folder. I'll then go to Perfect Layers. I'll launch Perfect Layers as normal. Just double-click the icon. So here's Perfect Layers opened up as new. In the final version of Perfect Layers, you'll actually be able to go to File and select New and create a whole new blank layer. That's coming. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Open, and I'm going to navigate to that folder with those roller coasters. So it was under this folder, Demo Images, Perfect Layers, Roller Coaster. And here are the same 4 images, except we're not in Lightroom. We're just in our normal Finder or Explorer. I'm going to hit Open, and here are our 4 images. One of the main differences between working as a standalone and working from Lightroom is in Lightroom, the layers will be background, background 1, background 2, background 3. In standalone, it'll retain the original file names, so you can go ahead and rename these as you see fit. Whenever you do these kind of motor drive sequences, or really whenever you're working in more than 2 layers, you really should, I like to start at the bottom 2 layers. I don't start masking from the top, because by starting at the bottom as you're masking, you're compounding your mask upward as opposed to going downward. So here I'm going to show you a quick tool called the trim tool. Trim tool is this little scissor. And what the trim tool does is it allows you to draw a selection, a crop, kind of like a crop box, over the part of the layer that you want to keep. So here, after I draw my selection, if I need to make it wider or reposition it, I can. Now, when the selection is made, you can see that in this image, I just want this roller coaster car to appear. I want to mask out everything else and reveal the layer under it. I'm going to hit Enter, and that masks everything out. And you can see you've got these different mask options, kind of like in Photoshop. If you drop down the mask option, you hit Overlay, that's your mask, or white, or the old school way of just black and white. So overlay is a good way to look at how you're masking or where you're masking. And now you can repeat the process. So here I'm going to select this image. I'm going to go to my trim tool again, and I'm just going to kind of make a tight selection around here. I'm going to hit Enter, and you can see how it's compounding the mask. Now, sometimes you want to refine stuff, like if you zoom in here, you can see that the track is misaligned. So because I moved a little bit when I was taking my picture. So here all you need to do is I'm just going to drop my masking brush and bring my opacity up and just kind of fill that in so that I have the alignment there. I'm also going to remove that back car here because I want to have the front of this car. So I'm just going to remove one of those cars. And then one more time, turn this top layer on, go to the trim tool, make your selection, hit Enter. And here we need to fix this as well. Or what we can do is we can undo that. I can drop my opacity down, and then I can use my Move tool to align the images. So now the images are aligned over here. I can bring my opacity up and reuse the trim tool. You'll always want to make sure if you're not using a tripod that you align your images if you're compositing, because you don't want to have any broken lines. So here we go. We've got our nice kind of motor drive sequence. I can go to File. If I want to export to JPEG or TIFF, I can. Or I can go to File, Save. I'll just save this to the desktop. I'll call it Roller Coaster Motor Drive Sequence. It's going to save the layered PSD file. Now, if you want to work on this image again in perfect layers, what you can do is you can go back to perfect layers here, go to File, Open, navigate to the desktop, and open up that PSD file. And you'll have your layers there with the masks intact. So you can continue working on it, go to File, Save, and update it. And then if you need to send it to Photoshop, you can do that as well. Here's the thing. If you do certain things in Photoshop to this file, like add a smart object or add a vector or an alpha channel, and you try to bring it into perfect layers, you'll get a warning in perfect layers that says this PSD file contains elements that are not currently supported. If you want to work on perfect layers, we will automatically flatten this image for you. So just be mindful of that. If you do certain things in Photoshop, currently it's not going to be totally backwards compatible with perfect layers. What it'll do is it will flatten that image. Okay. I just want to see if there are any quick questions. There is no current auto align tool. Right now you have to manually align your layers. So I hope that answered. I see a few questions about that. Okay. With that, let me I'm just reading Frank these few questions.
Yeah, no problem.
There's some really nice positive feedback actually. Frank, people, I love I love when whenever you start doing textures in photo frame. To me, that's when I'm like, that's when I know I'm always going to learn something new from you. Um,
Had to throw that in, right?
Hey, why not? I mean, to me, that's an important. You hit something that I kind of was hoping someone would hit, and I did this on my webinar yesterday.
Okay.
Is these products work in tandem with each other? So,
Yeah.
um, and it's a whole big shebang. You know, Frank understands it. Look, there's some things that he needs to do in Photoshop. That's fine, but for the most part, blending and masking, it's a great alternative.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.